are crazy, you know that?
We are talking Something in the Woods, also known as Ravening Woods. And this is directed by Alexander T.Hwang. And this is a low-budget creature feature movie that has a Wendigo as our kind of antagonist. Now, the story features two women who are at odds with one another. One is a successful reporter who has recently broken a new story which has taken down some corrupt officials. And we have one of these kind of the family members of these corrupt officials wanting revenge for kind of smearing her family. So this woman kidnaps this reporter and takes her out to the woods to execute her. However, they are not alone, as there seems to be a ravenous creature in the woods, and they must kind of put aside their differences, work together to see if they can overcome this evil. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So let us discuss. So this is a very, very low budget movie, and it's quite a short film. What can we say that works in this movie? So one of the kind of elements that I did think was actually quite well done was the kind of the setup of this kind of rivalry between these kind of two women. I thought it would have been very easy to have them simply as like love rivals fighting over some guy, and that would have been quite typical and ultimately kind of had the same result. But I thought this was a much better kind of, and a little bit more original kind of idea, and a deeper kind of idea as well, with these two women through a kind of professional kind of means. This kind of, ultimately this woman kind of getting cancelled by this journalist. And of course that speaks to, you know, the kind of the real life modern kind of situations that are kind of happening where people are kind of getting cancelled and their kind of careers are ending, and kind of like lives are kind of smashed through these kind of cancellations. So I actually thought it was you know, quite a modern kind of idea to have this kind of as a setup for why these sort of two women are at odds with one another. And of course it makes our kind of our main character, this kind of journalist, you know, she's kind of feeling all good about herself the beginning of the movie, very, very cocky, you know, pleased with herself. She's got, you know, much more kind of exposure, more money, etc. And she goes on this kind of journey where that's pretty much all stripped away. And I think the actress did a reasonable job here. I'm not saying this is, you know, Daniel Day-Lewis kind of like levels of acting here, but for a kind of a lower budget B movie, I thought the actress did a reasonable job here, kind of portraying this kind of character going on quite kind of dramatic kind of journey as the kind of the movie progresses. And the last thing I would say is the creature itself. There is some major issues with this creature, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I kind of found the design interesting. It's an interesting and somewhat of a odd choice for a kind of a Wendigo movie. It kind of looks like a skinny orc, is the best way I'll describe it. Now, we are going to have some talk about some issues with that, but I kind of found this an interesting choice for a kind of creature, and you know, a little bit more unusual in terms of design than you would typically see in a kind of a film like this. So let us transition to now what doesn't work with this movie. And I have to be honest with you, I'm sad to say it's quite a lot that unfortunately doesn't work. This is a movie that I feel was, and then this is my speculation, probably quite a rushed production, because it just feels like there's little attention to detail here. And I'm going to give you some examples of why I say that in a minute. But I just want to come back to the creature just for a second, because you know, this is a creature feature. This is being billed as the kind of what sort of movie it is. So I suspect the majority of people will kind of watch this movie in expectation of the creature. Now, the decision here was to have a CGI creature rather than a man in a suit. And I really don't think that was the best choice, to be honest. Now, it's a low budget film, as I've said. And maybe they couldn't get a good enough kind of like looking kind of makeup or costume or something, but I think it would have been better than the CGI. The CGI here looks quite basic, to be honest, and it almost looks to the point where it looks cartoonish. So you almost feel like you're watching the horror version of, like, you know, Roger Rabbit or something, because this kind of CGI creation kind of looks so at odds with the kind of the real life, obviously shots that are kind of it's kind of, you know, put over essentially. It really doesn't look very good. And as much as I found the design interesting, it you know, it looks a little bit weird. If you've ever seen the Mortal Kombat 1995 movie, it kind of looks a little bit like a reptile character, if you know what I mean. But yeah, it's skinny orc otherwise, but it's not particularly well realised, certainly not well rendered. I mean, I thought the idea was it had some interesting elements to it, but it really isn't particularly kind of you know, well utilised. They would have much been better having a man in a suit, even a kind of if they're struggling for kind of budget here, even having this kind of this maybe a zombie looking kind of creature would have been better than they think than what they ended up with. The creature also really isn't on screen a hell of a lot. You know, you've probably got 10, 15, 20 seconds of creature on screen in the movie. Not a lot. A lot of it is kind of done off screen. A lot of it is done with kind of like you hear the creatures kind of like howls and stuff, and that's kind of, or it's like a POV shot and things like that. So there's, again, it's a very, very low budget movie, so they're kind of using these techniques to try and save money by not actually having, you know, VFX on kind of screen. So very, very little actual kind of footage of the kind of the creature in the movie. And that leads to the next problem, which is the bulk of the movie is really these kind of two women in dialogue sequences. And obviously there certainly is a need for these kind of dialogue sequences, but it's very kind of like mundane a lot of the time. And I think after the kind of the initial setup and the meat, I really don't think there's much to it. You know, it's meant to have this kind of this kind of arc where these women are kind of trusting each other. But they used to spend the bulk of the movie doing this, unfortunately. There's not really much else that's involved. You know, there's a park ranger that kind of, that is briefly in it. But, yeah, it's not really kind of much there, unfortunately. It becomes quite dull. And, you know, as much as I think the main actress did a good job, I'm not saying it's brilliant. And some of the other acting in the movie, you know, is not quite particularly, you know, strong or compelling in any kind of sense of the word. There's also kind of like a real kind of lack of detail in this movie. And I'm not going to go through everything, but I'll just give you one example to kind of demonstrate what I mean by this. So not long after the beginning of the movie, our reporter character is kidnapped, and she's bundled in the trunk of a car and tied up. She has like a sort of rag in her mouth to stop her screaming. Now this rag isn't secured, it's literally just poked in her mouth. And she's stopped by this park ranger, the kind of the kidnapper, and you know, this woman who's kind of tied up could have easily just gone and spat this rag out, because it's not like secured in there. But she's like, I can't speak. You know, it's just really, you can't just go and spit the rag out. You know, it's that sort of silliness, that lack of attention to detail. You just think, oh, you know, you can't really take this movie as a kind of any type of have real dramatic tension, because it's just so silly, which is a shame, because I think the kind of the idea of having these women at odds through you know, this kind of like reporting kind of situation and the circumstances, I think would have lent itself to some kind of genuine dramatic sequences, because like I've said, it's kind of taken right out of kind of like modern headlines, and I think was certainly a good idea. But once we're going to get past that sort of setup, so to speak, it just kind of goes into silly kind of territory. And as the film progresses and we kind of have these kind of women fighting survival, again, it just becomes very, very kind of silly kind of sequences, and just like dialogue sequences that seem to repeat the same point over and over again. One of them has got a weapon, but they don't trust the other one, but we kind of have to keep bleating on about the kind of the same point over and over again. Not a lot actually kind of happens. There's very little kind of sense of any real kind of threat, because the actual creature is handled quite poorly. There's some like, you know, this creature's like screaming and howling in the woods, and they're like, oh, is that a deer? It's like, oh God. And then the ending also is pretty weak. So overall, this unfortunately is a little bit of a, well, lackluster is being kind, I have to say. It's actually quite a disappointing film, to be honest with you. I think, you know, the idea of how these women were at odds, I think was good, but that's kind of really the best thing I can say about it. The actual horror elements of this are at best lackluster and at worst boring and poorly handled. So it's a 3 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to you next time. Bye for now.